I guess it's high time I go back to the show, but I feel like this one's necessary since I feel like I haven't said enough about it. Now, I love South Park. It's without a doubt my favorite show of all time. I enjoyed the characters, the writing, the humor, all of it, and I do obsess over it to an unhealthy degree. And despite the drastic change within the show's dynamic, it still manages to do well with fans, with even the most recent episodes proving the series still holds up to this day. I mean, sure, this was the same show that relied too much on story arcs in season 19 and 20, but after that they went back to their original roots with it just being an episodic show. Now, it's no secret that the show has relied on many serialized topics, but I see that as a positive because for the most part, it makes the characters relatable based on how they feel about a serialized event, whether it be puberty, not taking someone's death very well, or just having problems accepting change in the world. But there's one thing I've noticed within the show when it comes to being serialized, and that's the topic of how it deals with toxic relationships. Because despite the characters being very memorable, it does have a ton of cases where it creates conflicts between many of them. Because despite me not liking a lot of the relationships in the show, at least the show does take notice of it and try to do something about it. And that's basically what this video is about, to show you how South Park is able to notice the animosity in relationships and is able to explore what it would be like if they weren't together. I think to start off, we gotta understand what toxic really means. By definition, it means very harmful or unpleasant in a pervasive or insidious way. And a lot of the characters, despite their positive attributes, can get pretty harmful. Because despite their justifications, it still doesn't create anything positive at all. In fact, it only makes it worse. Not for the viewer, because I'm referring to in-universe. An example would have to be Stan and Kyle, and while for the most part they do agree on a variety of things, every now and then their friendship is gonna be tested. A great example would have to be the season 11 episode, Guitar Hero. Yes, I can't say that word. Where after the boys get really good at Guitar Hero, their manager wants to take their skills to the next level. But then he tells Stan that Kyle was holding him back and decides to replace the latter with this kid named Thad Jarvis. Now, you might be saying that their friendship was tested because of their manager. Well, not really. Stan could have easily denied this offer because he didn't want to choose success over friendship, but then he went the other way around considering he only cared about the points, much to Kyle's dismay. But then Stan realizes that he's been taking Guitar Hero too seriously and forgot the most important part about video games, which was to have fun. He then reconciles with Kyle and they go back to having fun together. I know some people may think I'm just explaining an episode that breaks up relationships and bringing them back together at the end. I mean, I guess I kind of am, but the whole point of the episode was to show what it would be like for Stan and Kyle not hanging out anymore, and having the breaking point of their breakup be with a video game was pretty smart. Now, despite their reconciliation at the end, they already do it again with the Black Friday trilogy from season 17, where Stan and Kyle's friendship was put to the test yet again after they make huge disagreements on which console is better. And while the episode in question was meant to be a satire, I don't think the relationship is. But what really made it worse was when Cartman shitted on an old man's garden and blamed it on Stan, all because he wanted to convince him that the Xbox is better. I can argue that this was more brutal than Guitar Hero, but like that episode, they put their differences aside. However, the episode didn't have much time for the characters to make up, pretty much proving how distant they're starting to get. However, as the series goes on, they started to get more uncomfortable with each other, and the entirety of season 19 really shows it, where after Kyle makes a speech about how Caitlyn Jenner is a brave and stunning woman, the Canadians start to come in South Park, Colorado, and Carmen comes to the conclusion that it all happened because of Kyle's speech, and while Kyle objects it, Stan says,
"You did kind of go overboard, dude."
even though he didn't. All he said was that Caitlyn Jenner is a hero, and even then he himself didn't want to make that speech in the first place. But what really is out of character for Stan was the fact that he suddenly has a problem with Kyle's speeches, despite the fact that he's given speeches himself in many episodes prior to this one. Also, I don't like how he's suddenly siding with Carmen, despite what the latter saying being complete bullshit. I get that Stan isn't the wisest person around, but he definitely has a lot more common sense than just siding with a manipulator over his best friend. But after that, they decided to throw hands because Stan thought Kyle didn't want the kids to investigate PC Principal, resulting in them and the rest of the town to threaten each other with guns, until they realized that the real enemy was Leslie. Honestly, with a brutal moment such as this between characters, you'd think they'd give time for them to be friends again, right? Not really. But considering what they've had with each other before this episode, I think it's for the best. But it wasn't until the vaccination special came out where it finally acknowledges that what these boys had was abusive. They didn't have the same dynamic as they used to before.
Look, let's just face it, you guys. We don't trust each other and we don't like each other. We can't keep pretending. Are you seriously saying what I think?
Now every other episode would have everything reset, right? Well actually this episode did something very different, and that was keeping the story going, leaving it at a cliffhanger. By the time the episode was over, fans have been clamoring about how the relationship between the boys would ever get resolved. That is until 8 months later when the post-COVID 2-parter was released, and it goes on to explore how the breakup between the boys was executed. You can see the struggle they go through as adults, but after Kyle informs Stan that Kenny died, it suddenly encourages them to work together to find out the culprit. But then it was revealed that Kenny died due to Stan, Cartman, and Kyle's argumentative behavior. See, Kenny didn't have any part in this whole breakup between the boys, knowing the fact that he's the quiet one of the group, so it would make sense for him to try to save their broship. And while their relationship at the end was saved, their dynamic wasn't exactly the same as before. Even some of my favorite episodes recently, such as Help My Teenager Hates Me, didn't quite have that. But it was still nice for an episode to feature the boys together, especially Stan and Kyle. And that's what I loved about the relationship between the boys, was that anytime they would fight or something, they never treated it as a big surprise, and when they would, it wouldn't be so common. Now whether or not a toxic relationship can be resolved or not, they still depicted characters being extremely hostile towards one another, and as the show went on, the boys have created relationships with other people. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't a fan of any of them. Let's start with Carmen's relationship with Heidi. Basically it all started back in season 20, where the two of them became a couple after quitting Twitter. Throughout the entirety of the season, they really hit it off, much to everyone else's disgust. But by season 21, Carmen started to manipulate Heidi in many ways. This involved threatening to kill himself after an incident that occurred, which involved him calling her a whore and pushing her in front of a car. He also manipulated her into hating Jews, even after Kyle told her about how evil Cartman is. But none of that comes close to making her abandon her diet, which involved bringing a bucket of KFC and claiming that it was vegan meat. Now even though what Cartman did was fucked up, not surprisingly, I'm also giving blame to Heidi for this. She should be smart enough to know the differences between vegan meat and actual meat. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of Heidi as a whole, I just couldn't help but feel bad for what she had to go through in this relationship. I mean, she literally turned into a female version of Cartman halfway through, and we all know how that went.
Hey, Snuggle! Okay, honey.
I'm not trying to say that Cartman was a huge dickhead to Heidi, because at the same time the latter should have left him when she had the chance to do so. She eventually does at the end of season 21, with no chances of them getting back together. I'm honestly glad their relationship didn't last long, because it just shows how forced it can be without giving it time to make things interesting. And while not the worst relationship of all time, it's just too tedious for me to care. But one relationship that's not only tedious but unbearable to watch is Stan and Wendy. Earlier in the series, Stan had a huge crush on Wendy and would throw up anytime she would talk to him. For the first few moments they were on screen together, it wasn't all that bad. Sure, it wasn't anything great, but neither of them had huge conflicts with each other. But I believe the beginning of the end of their relationship would be the season 7 episode Raisins, where Stan experiences his first breakup with Wendy, after finding out that she's dating Token, and he goes into a deep depression, and his attempts at getting her back fail completely. It would make the episode pointless for the two to get back together at the end, but the episode did a bold move and have the message be that a breakup is hard, but there's a lot worse in the world that's gonna happen, so Stan just has to cope with it.
Hey, Wendy! You're a bitch. Token, right here, buddy.
Unfortunately, they do butt heads a couple episodes after this, where a lot of their interactions is just nothing more than just bickering all the fucking time. But I feel like a lot of the time, it was more or less of Wendy doing the bitching and Stan just taking it. Now don't get me wrong, Wendy is one of my favorite characters of the show. I may not find her as relatable as Kenny, Kyle, or Stan, but I really like how over the course of the show, she became a lot more open with her opinions, regardless of it being controversial. I always like seeing that side to Wendy as opposed to her being stuck in an on and off relationship, and I feel like she's a lot more unreasonable than Stan ever was.
I think you look cute in your bunny costume? What is that supposed to mean?
I have no idea.
That's what Susan92 wrote on your Facebook wall! You give girls pictures of you in bunny outfits? Fuck you!
But what makes it all worse is that they've tried several times to bring them back together, only to have it fall within the same conflict with Wendy having a victim complex.
Burster? Are you sure you're not just saying all that because you want her to end up with Bebe?
Yes, I do. But you know what? I'd rather have Wendy end up with anyone that isn't Stan. But I say Bebe because even though they haven't been on screen together much, the times that they were, they seem to be very acquainted with each other, with Wendy asking Bebe for advice and the latter being obliged to help. It was really cute. I mean, if my fan arts of these characters doesn't show it, then I don't know what does. I mean, sure, it does go downhill when Bebe tries to kill Wendy over a pair of shoes, but then a season later they somehow made up. But again, they weren't on screen together as much as Cindy was. Although they would be at it again with Bebe calling Wendy a hater because of her hatred for Kim Kardashian. But with moments like this, it never really got to the point where it was excessive or mean-spirited at all, because you can see where both of them were coming from. As of now, it is unclear whether or not Wendy and Baby are on good or decent terms, but if they were to end up together, then hopefully the show will take time for them to develop, or even make an episode where throughout it all is them figuring out on whether or not they should be together. And it would make sense knowing their distaste for boys in the later seasons. But with Wendy and Stan, it just doesn't get the same appeal because they do this frequently with neither of them coming to an agreement on how they can compromise, to the point where I would have preferred if they'd broken up permanently, because the last interaction that they've had together was in Return of COVID, where they decided to spend New Year's together. A lot of people have been hoping for them to get back together one last time, but considering their previous encounters, I highly doubt it'll ever happen. Plus, they haven't been very consistent on whether or not they like each other or not, so it's very unlikely that it'll happen. But none of these relationships come close to the relationship between Randy and Sharon. This is a relationship we see a lot more in the series, even more so than the relationship between the four boys, but that doesn't really make it good. Now, it is true that Sharon is the voice of reason to Randy's idiocy, but they're both very heated with each other and constantly get into random and pointless arguments, although they have been divorced twice but came back together in the same episodes. Now, since the relationship is the one we see more than the others, that doesn't mean that it's gonna be good. It's not only annoying to sit through, but it becomes very boring as well. It basically consists of Randy doing a shitty thing and Sharon calling him out on it. And as much as I love Randy, I feel as if he was part of the issue as well. At least Sharon wouldn't do what Randy did, and that was of course starting a farm and making Integrity weed, which was the straw that broke the camel's back in the relationship. There was even a point in the post-COVID two-parter where after the pandemic ended, Sharon wanted a divorce because Randy wouldn't give her half the farm, which eventually led into them arguing again. But what came off as shocking was the fact that Stan got sick and tired of their arguing, and so he had to burn the whole business down to the ground. Unfortunately, just like the others, they don't really make the breakup permanent, they just still keep it going and it continues down its downward spiral. It's not always bad, they do have their moments where they have fun together, but for the most part they just stand there like two blocks of wood who are just fed up with each other, and it's like, why keep them together if 90% of it is just complete hostility?
Don't you dare suggest that I'm only emotional because
I'm just pointing out that it is around that time.
Get out, Randy! I'm not overreacting!
Okay, love you, honey. I'll leave you alone.
To conclude this, as toxic as a lot of South Park relationships can be, it's also nice how the creators acknowledge most of them and try to do something about it instead of having the characters be at each other's throats every now and then. Which did happen, but at least they weren't blind to it. But it's actually a shame that not a lot of shows do this. I think an example of a show that almost never does what South Park does in exploring relationships is Family Guy, where despite the show itself not being as bad as people make it out to be, the relationships, especially Brian and Stewie, are extremely toxic and they all fall under the exact same interactions constantly where they're just assholes to each other. Now, I would forgive that if it wasn't for the fact that despite the extreme altercations between characters, the show still wants you to believe that they love each other, as if them fighting or insulting each other never happened. But anyone with at least half a brain would know that it's not even true at all.
God, I can't kill Brian, even for Penelope. He's my dog, my friend. Well, wonder what words are gonna come out of this pen today. All right, I can do this.
But South Park does a good job in making all the relationships have different dynamics, and setting up new ways on how they would react depending on the conflict they're in. But despite me mentioning the toxic side of the relationships, I still believe that there are a lot of healthy relationships as well. There would be a slight chance I would make a sequel to this video on how South Park can create positive relationships too. Maybe not soon, but maybe when I get the motivation to do so. I am hoping that the future seasons will bring back old relationships or introduce new ones, and they try to make the characters involved in it consistent. And if they don't, then it would be fair to just keep them apart instead of resetting everything. Because at the end of the day, South Park would almost always take notice of something getting repetitive and knowing when enough is enough. Which again, we've never seen a ton of shows do that. So this show is definitely unique when it comes to that area. Of course, this entire video is my subjective opinion and I don't speak for everyone. Because in the end, it doesn't really matter. Everyone sees their own thing in it.